Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation with Alexander Sulfaro on why don't we hallucinate our mental images. The research paper on perception as a hierarchical competition has been circling around our member community, and we're very excited to have Alex here to talk about these fascinating findings. Alex is a final year PhD student at Sydney Computational Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory at the University of Sydney in Australia. His research explores the mechanisms behind internally generated sensory experiences like mental images, hallucinations, and dreams. Currently, Alex is researching whether images and sounds are imagined differently, whether the content of imagery can be decoded from brain recordings, why mental images don't look like real images, and whether we can even measure mental differences in mental imagery at all. So with that, welcome, Alex. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello. It's really nice to be here.
So for anyone who might be joining us for the first time, the format of this will be like all our other presentations. Alex will present for about 30 minutes on his research, and when he's finished, I'll join Alex back on stage to do a Q&A on any of the questions that you might have for Alex. Feel free to type those into the YouTube chat if you're watching live. And without any further ado, Alex, I'll throw your slides on screen and let you take it away.
Perfect. So we've got quite a bit to talk about today. I just want to start out by kind of setting up how I view mental imagery and thoughts generally. So to kind of talk about mental images, we have to talk about thinking and thoughts. And a lot of the time when we're thinking about things, we don't really see what we're thinking about or experience it in any way. We just kind of know that we're thinking about something. And these are kind of our abstract thoughts we might have, but we don't really experience them. And then we have our sensory thoughts. So these are things where we in some way kind of see or hear or smell even, whatever it is we're thinking about. And those are what we call mental images, right? But this isn't just a metaphor when we talk about, having sensory thoughts or having mental images. They're actually in some way things we have a sensory experience of, right? And I love kind of going through the Aphantasia subreddit for excellent memes like this one on this very matter, right? So this isn't just some sort of metaphor. It's something that actually, we experience when we have mental images. But the thing is, mental images, they're not really like real images at the same time, like actual images. So if you think about like real images, so for instance, we just got this lovely picture of a camel here. Mental images aren't really like anything like real images for some reason, but they're also not like hallucinations, and they're also not like dreams. So when I'm talking about these, I'm talking about phenomena that they are internally generated sensory experiences, okay? And even though mental images are also supposed to be internally generated, these things look completely different. So hallucinations and dreams, they're very, vivid, lifelike experiences, but mental images aren't for some reason. And we kind of see a lot of these popping up, these sorts of things where we try to figure out how mental images are different or not that visible in the same way hallucinations, dreams, real images are. But the thing is, I've made this claim here that they're not also like real images or actual images, but all of these kind of depictions of mental imagery in its degraded state, they are using actual images, right? The images just have degraded, contrast and saturation or different shapes showing in, but they're all kind of depicting or trying to replicate the experience of mental imagery with actual images. But I'll kind of argue today, I don't think this is really potentially possible to do at all, just because of the kind of nature of mental imagery. I don't think it might even be possible to emulate with any real image. And this is kind of because mental images they're kind of called quasi-sensory experiences a lot. So they're sensory, but like not really sensory. And I want to point out that this isn't just a matter of detail. It's not just that they are, low contrast or they're kind of don't have much color information or they're blurry or something like that. The kind of key takeaway is that mental images, when you have them, they really, well, for most people anyway, they don't tend to replace real images in the visual fields. So if you take any kind of region of where you're looking at in space, you don't see what you imagine there instead of the actual, content in the world. Whereas if you think about hallucinations or even dreams, it doesn't really matter how blurry they are or how, low contrast or whatever it is. Hallucinations they replace a particular region of the visual field with hallucinated content instead of real content. And this is kind of something that even applies if you think about dreams. So when you dream, you don't see the back of your eyelids, you see, what you're actually dreaming about instead, right? So for some reason, mental images don't do this, but hallucinations and dreams do. So I just want to cover kind of what even is a quasi-sensory experience, and then move on to talking about why mental images are quasi-sensory, even though these other phenomenon, real hallucinated, and dreamed images, they are not. And this might get a bit funky, so we're going to talk about perceptual experience first. And this is kind of a philosophical discussion a lot of the time, but let's kind of go into this. So this is a picture I made the other day. There's just a bunch of scattered noise, really. So you can see in it that there's some, there's plenty of edge information, there's spatial information going in here. It's black and white, right? But ultimately, it's kind of a meaningless, just splosh of, not much of randomness. But if I fade in this image, so this is a picture that I have sitting in my lounge room right now. But if you look at this image and then return back to the original, you can now see there's all these kind of elements that are familiar from that image. So what was once before just a splotch of basically just visual noise now has some meaningful information in it. So I'll give you that again. Just to see that, you can see where this squirrel is kind of sitting there now. And I kind of bring this up because I want to point out that when we experience things, we don't just experience things in a visual way or an auditory way or whatever it is. We have different kind of layers to experience. So whereas before we viewed this just as a visual experience, we can now view it as a visual experience of a bunch of black and white, but also as an abstract experience of it's now actually depicting something. We know what it is as well. And it kind of feels different to experience this image when we know what it is. There's some sort of qualitative difference there. And a few more examples of this. So we know that this is a camel. We can look at this image and figure out, yep, that's a camel. But we also know that this is a camel, and we know that this is a camel as well. So these three images, and even if I put up like a cartoon picture of a camel, maybe one that was blue instead of yellow, right? All these different visual experiences correspond to the same sort of abstract experience that we know this is a camel that we're looking at, okay? And so all these different sensory experiences can have the same abstract experience. And here I want to show you a different example. We have a picture of a frog, which is also a picture of a horse, which you probably can't see until I do that, until I turn it around. And then you can see it's a horse facing to the left here. The thing is, if I sit this in the middle of that kind of tilt, you can interpret it, you can swap from interpreting the same pixel information, right? The same visual information you can interpret as a frog, or you can interpret it as a horse. And something about your conscious experience of this image changes when you do that, even though it's not the visual experience of it, okay? The kind of colors and points remain the same. So the kind of point I'm getting at here is perceptual experience involves sensory and abstract components to it. So it's not just visual experience when we look at images. And it's not even just sensory and abstract components. So there's a whole spectrum of different components here. So we can go from highly sensory all the way to non-sensory, which is also just another way of saying abstract here. So for instance, when we look at this camel, we can extract this really abstract knowledge about it, that it is a camel. But we have kind of layers of getting to this. So look at the colors in the image. We can figure out where the edges are. From the edges, we can build up curves. From different curves, you can build up different shapes. And from the shapes, you figure out body parts, stuff like that. You'll kind of know that there's an arm and a leg present. And then you know what this is. This is some sort of animal, and that it's a camel in particular, right? So this kind of process, you build up from the information beforehand, but you experience all of these at once. So you can just look at this image and you know it has curves, you know it has arms and legs, and you know what it is, all while seeing it at the same time. And I kind of think of this like perception being like a slice of a tiered cake in a way. So if you think about perception as, well, you could perceive, you know, a million different things, and at any given point of time, we just perceive one kind of subsect of those, one slice of those. But the thing is, we could just take a slice from the visual side of things. We generally don't do that. We kind of have all these other aspects as well. So we're basically taking a slice down the middle here, and our perceptual experience is a stack of all these different things at once experienced together. And like I kind of showed with all those camels and the frog and horse, is that the sensory and abstract features, they don't need to match all the time. So they can be referring to different things. So you could have an abstract experience of a camel because you're actually seeing a camel in front of you, but you could have an abstract experience of something else, or be, you know, thinking about something else, even though you're still seeing a camel in front of you, something like that. And this is kind of akin to like each of these tiers in the cake being different flavors, if you want to think about that, or they could all be the same flavor, right? There's no really big rules upon that. So that is kind of, when we're thinking about real images, we have these different abstract and sensory components. And generally, yeah, so a real percept, like something you're seeing in the environment, tends to at least have these really highly sensory components, but not necessarily these, you know, complicated abstract ones. But this applies to internally generated experiences like thoughts too. So abstract thoughts have these kind of non-sensory properties to them, so we can just kind of sit there, know what we're thinking, and we don't really experience those thoughts, but we know we're thinking about stuff. Whereas hallucinations and dreams, they often involve this really highly sensory information, and not necessarily this non-sensory information, but yeah, they often have that as well. So, but they're generally getting all the way down to the sensory level over here. Mental images are a bit weird though, because for some reason or another, they don't seem to do this. Okay, so this is what we're talking about with a quasi-sensory experience. They're somehow sitting in the middle between these abstract thoughts and hallucinations, where they are not just a non-sensory abstract experience and not quite a highly sensory visual experience. They're somewhere in between. And I absolutely love this example, again, from the Aphantasia subreddit, where I think someone was describing their lack of imagery, but I think this is more realistic depiction of probably the normal state of mental imagery. So here this person is showing how they visualize an elephant, where they kind of know that it has like a tail in this region, and it has a trunk over here, you know, it has a head over here, and a body in the middle, but they don't see any of it, right? There's no visual content there. This isn't an actual image of an elephant, but they know that certain regions of space are certain things, right? Certain visual things, certain abstract things. And I think this is quite a good example of what ends up being a quasi-sensory experience, which is, yeah, probably what mental imagery is. That's all kind of, it's not necessarily like a fact. These are just kind of things I think, and kind of things I think that work best for understanding the kind of phenomena of what we actually experience. But yeah, so this is what I think is actually a quasi-sensory experience, some sort of not quite abstract, not quite sensory sort of thing. So now I want to talk about, okay, so if mental imagery is that, some sort of quasi-sensory thing, why is it quasi-sensory while everything else isn't, basically? So why are mental images only pushing a little bit towards this highly sensory side of things? And to understand that, we have to kind of know that all this perceptual information, whether it's really, really visual or really, really abstract, that's kind of encoded somewhere in the brain, and it's kind of roughly represented by this axis here. Okay, so when information goes into your eyes, which are at the front, but information actually goes to the back of the brain, and is processed by a visual cortex at the back here. And if we look at kind of this whole region, which is roughly corresponding to where this visual information turns into abstract information, we kind of know that mental imagery and real perception, they use these kind of regions. They both probably use the same regions here, these similar perceptual resources. just that real perception starts at the back of the brain in the visual cortex and moves along. And that's why you can get, an image hits your retina and then you can figure out what it is and actually interact with it, right, as a meaningful object. But mental imagery, we think it uses the same system, it's just doing it in the opposite direction. And you might have heard this before from other people's talks as well. But basically, we're trying to get some sort of abstract idea converted into more visual information in our brain. The thing is, so they are using potentially the same system in the brain, but also mental imagery doesn't really occur alone too. So when we think about mental images, we're always doing them while we are awake, like pretty much by definition, right? If you have some sort of sensory experience while you are asleep or you're in a coma or whatever it is, that would be a dream. So while we're awake, if we're trying to do mental imagery, that's, it always has to occur at the same time, or actually our regular perceptual system, which is trying to detect, things in the environment, is also on and active at the same time. So mental imagery and real perception or environmental perception, they kind of occur together. And you can think about, even when your eyes are closed, this doesn't mean that real perception isn't occurring. You're still perceiving the environment in that case. It's just that now you're perceiving something really, really boring, just the back of your eyelids now. So if they occur at the same time and they use these kind of similar processes, then these real and imagined stimuli, they should probably interact with each other in some way. So they should compete or interfere, some sort of interaction should probably occur. And what we kind of looked at was whether this competition or interference or whatever it was could cause the unique appearance of mental images. Could that be responsible? Because mental images always have to fight against, real perception to use our perceptual resources. So what we did, we tried to make a model to simulate this competition and kind of see what would happen. And we're basically looking at, how mental images, how imagined stimuli could spread through, like a simulated brain, and recruit these early visual areas with or without the presence of competition. And what we actually did, so to try and kind of simplify this, we tried to model this kind of this pathway in the brain, and we kind of just split it up into 5 sections, and I'm just going to turn them on their side here. So our visual to abstract axis is now going down to up here, and we converted those sections into just kind of different layers, which we're just trying to simulate kind of holding perceptual information at different levels of kind of that brain region. So each layer, is holding information about something that's actually being perceived here in our model, in our little simulated brain. And what we can do is we can feed in these these stimuli, so equivalent to like real visual inputs hitting your eye, and convert them through this pathway into some sort of abstract knowledge or thought or something. So something that could, potentially be recalled later from long-term memory. So we had that kind of pathway moving up here, and we also modeled the other pathway of mental imagery, where you have this abstract knowledge you've obtained from seeing stuff before, and you're trying to convert that down into a more visual form of information. And our assumptions are that basically each layer here contributes information to your kind of conscious experience of the information encoded in the system. And we notice, so the mental imagery, we don't model it as going all the way back down to the very bottom, because this is where our kind of retina is, and the retina doesn't really, as far as we know, really get feedback all the way back there. The kind of key point, though, is we allow these processes to occur roughly at the same time, so in kind of upwards and down sweeps. And each layer can mix information from the layer above and layer below. So it's just doing like a weighted average here, some sort of very simple approximation of interference, or like some rule for combining the information in these layers. And what we're looking at, and I'll just play it again, is how this kind of high level neural representation can push down to these low levels with or without competition. So if we actually model that, we can imagine, well, let's pretend that we are seeing something and imagining another thing up here. So we are seeing a camel in front of us, and we are trying to imagine a hat. So I'm just using images here to try and show you what happens to these stimuli. But in reality, kind of, we can't really depict abstract information in a very visual way, right? It doesn't kind of, it's an intractable problem to do that. So we're just going to take, we're imagining a hat, or trying to imagine a hat, and we are seeing a camel. You notice the hat is a bit blurry here. This is because things get, when they get turned into abstract information, you actually kind of compress them a bit. You kind of lose information in that process. And we're just going to assume every other part of the brain is just doing nothing. It's just seeing static. And so what happens if we just do real perception only? So if we're not doing any mental imagery, if we stop thinking about the hat, what happens, we just pay attention to the camel in front of us, and what we see is that every kind of layer in the system, every part of our, that kind of perceptual stream in our brain, just becomes dominated by what we're actually seeing. So the camel, by seeing with our eyes, I mean. So this means we would both see and think about the camel as well, and kind of understand the camel in front of us, okay? Which is kind of probably what we do a lot of the time just in daily life, right? You want to pay attention to your environment. You want to know what's happening in your environment. But if you do mental imagery only, so this assumes we have some situation possible where we can get rid of this sort of input from our eyes, which isn't really the case for normal people. And it's kind of even not quite clear what exact state would constitute to cutting information off. Maybe some sort of blindness, but in this situation, if we get rid of the input from our eyes, the mental image, or what we're trying to imagine, is now uncontested. It could just flood through the system, push all the way back to these kind of regions, which are usually involved in representing really, really visual information. So we kind of think this should basically just be a hallucination, or the equivalent to experiencing hallucination, because you would be both thinking about that and quite literally seeing it in front of you, right? It would dominate your vision. But if we look at mental imagery during perception, if they both happen at the same time, we get this weird thing where there's some sort of mixing occurring. And above this point in the middle here, the thought, or whatever, that kind of internally generated content is dominating these areas relevant for abstract experience, but it's not going any lower. So it kind of decays off below this point. So your kind of thoughts here, when there's these two processes occurring at the same time, they kind of fail to dominate these areas, which are ultimately the areas that are probably going to contribute most to actually experiencing a particular stimulus as a visual experience. So we end up potentially just kind of being able to think about whatever we want, but not necessarily give it any sensory characteristics because of this competition from environmental stimuli. So basically, even though we think of mental imagery as kind of this isolated process which is occurring, and we're trying to, take that in abstract information, force it back into visual information, this probably isn't the case. It probably doesn't really work like that. There's some sort of interference pushing back against it, preventing it from kind of, moving all the way and becoming visual. So in answer to this question, why don't mental images look like real hallucinated images? Why don't we hallucinate our mental images? It's probably because of competition, or not necessarily probably, but it could be. It could be explained by competition from real perception. So that's kind of answering that kind of main question of why mental images are quasi-sensory, even though these other phenomena are not. Because potentially something like a dream or hallucination that's occurring when your brain is in some sort of state where there's no more competition from the rest of the world. So let's try and just see if this theory checks out at all. So basically, we've got a situation where the kind of influence of what we're imagining tends to decay towards the back of the brain, where we kind of represent things visually. And kind of evidence suggests that mental imagery really requires these temporal cortices, so regions of the temporal cortex, which is kind of this chunk of grayish area here. And so if you damage regions here, particularly diffusiform gyrus, which is actually below here, you can't really see it in this image that well, but if we damage these regions, we tend to knock out mental imagery. People just can't do it at all. And potentially because they can't generate anything. Okay, we're knocking out regions responsible or really necessary in the very early stages of mental imagery. But if we knock out these regions in the back, so in cases such as cortical blindness, so this is where you've damaged your visual cortex or some part of your early visual system, so you don't have the infrastructure to really see anymore. And even if you have really, really severe damage to that visual cortex, it doesn't really matter for mental imagery. People report that their mental imagery most of the time is pretty much unaffected. And this is the same case as well with something called agnosia, which you may or may not have heard about before. But agnosia is this quite wild phenomenon where people have problems in their visual system that stop them recognizing what objects are. So they can still see everything. They can still see an apple and see it as, you know, a red circular object, but they won't be able to figure out what it actually is. They can just kind of see the visual information, experience the visual information, but they get none of the abstract stuff. And the kind of belief around this is that this is because it's some sort of mid-level problem in their visual system. And these people, they also have fine mental imagery, so they don't report that their mental imagery changes at all for most of them. So this has kind of been a bit of a challenge for people to explain before, because we usually thought of mental imagery as, you know, it was quite a sensory, explicitly visual thing that was probably going to use, you know, really early visual cortex. But if we look at this model, it kind of works really well because it explains that, well, people with agnosia, they still have mental imagery because they never needed these regions to begin with to do mental imagery. You know, neurotypicals don't need those regions, so why would knocking them out cause any impairments in mental imagery? So kind of those two, or these three pieces of evidence together suggest that it's quite, mental imagery is mostly kind of having sway or influence over these kind of late stage, very abstract regions, and not many of the very early visual ones. Whether that's specifically because competition or not, I think is like a bigger issue, but at the very least, our findings kind of replicate this kind of distribution of information. So if this kind of theory works out, then we can actually explain quite a lot of common experiences. So the first is that obviously we don't hallucinate our thoughts, right? When we think about things, we don't hallucinate them. They don't replace what we're seeing in front of us in our visual field. And that is a very good thing, because you don't want to be driving down, you know, the street and then you start thinking about your cat and then you literally see your cat and nothing else, and you can no longer process, process the road in front of you, right? That's no good. But thoughts should also interfere with abstract processing as well. So we've kind of thought about real perception interfering with mental imagery, but it kind of works two ways here. So mental image is kind of blocked by real perception, but real perception is also being impaired by imagination or thinking or daydreaming, right? Because it can now no longer push all the way to these sensory areas. And that means you might have difficulty when you wander off. For instance, if you're daydreaming, you kind of stop processing the environment as well. Even though you might still see it, you'll stop processing what it means or be able to interact with it in a very effective way. So for instance, I often find myself, and you probably get this as well, where you will be reading a book and maybe it's not a particularly riveting book or something like that, but you might drift off, you might have things you're worried about that you're thinking about, and you will read the paragraph and then realize that you haven't taken any of it in, and you'll go back to the start and read it all again. And you'll just keep reading this paragraph over and over and over, because not once did you actually process what any of it meant. Even though every time you read it, you saw what was on the page, you didn't go blind, you still saw the page, but you stopped processing any of what it meant. So this kind of explains that you should get this kind of impact on real perception as well. We also potentially, even though we feel like we see our mental images, or some people do, right? We can't really, or we don't tend to be able to inspect them with any nuance. Like, we can't often use the visual information. And my argument is because it's not really there to begin with. So a lot of these regions involved in generating mental imagery, there's kind of evidence that they are also just involved in recognizing that you've seen an image as well, which to me suggests that whenever you kind of generate imagery, there's a good chance that it should feel like you've actually seen something, even if you haven't, right? You should get these object recognition sort of activation patterns, even if you haven't actually seen anything. And I think about this a lot with respect to drawing, because I draw a reasonable amount, but even though I think I can visualize my mother's face, for instance, there's no way there's enough information in that attempt at visualization to actually draw anything remotely resembling my mum, right? It also kind of explains why the kind of experience of mental imagery is so difficult to describe, because it's probably can't be replicated with any one image, right? It's like trying to describe what changes when you view this image as a frog compared to a horse, right? The pixels don't change, so what changes? It's really hard to describe that, but it feels like something changes. And yeah, like I said, we don't, potentially might not be able to replicate this with actual images, which is why I really like this kind of demo from before. So what about aphantasia and hyperphantasia? So potentially in kind of a neurotypical, we have just a balance between this internal content and external just pushing against each other, and they kind of balance out. But maybe in aphantasia, there's just not as strong of a push towards those sensory regions. So your mental images or your thoughts just kind of stay more abstract, whereas in hyperphantasia, you might just have more of that push. And it kind of just pushes back more on real perception, so you get more sensory thoughts. And of course, if you get rid of any competition altogether, then you should be having probably some sort of hallucinatory experience. So what modulates this balance? So we know we have serotonin in the brain, which kind of starts increasing towards the evening. And so when you get really, really drowsy, and this is the most common time that hallucinations actually occur if you have Charles-Bonnet syndrome, Parkinson's disease, many, many hallucinatory disorders, hallucinations tend to occur in the evening. And we know that serotonin actually dampens visual inputs as well. So it kind of stops you being as receptive, or stops your cells kind of being stimulated as well by the environment. That dampening is modulated by these receptors, which are also involved, or also targeted by hallucinogens, and they're also kind of overexpressed in people who hallucinate or have hallucinatory disorders as well. So potentially serotonin is just modulating how much sway this kind of external content has. Whereas acetylcholine is another one. So when we are awake, we have moderate levels of acetylcholine floating around in our visual system. When we're in deep sleep, so non-rapid eye movement sleep, we are basically unconscious, don't perceive anything. We don't have much acetylcholine floating around. When we're dreaming, though, in rapid eye movement sleep, we have a lot. There's a lot. And there's kind of good evidence from this guy here, Jean Aroux, that acetylcholine is just boosting the internally generated signal there. So it's basically causing that internal content or thoughts or mental image or whatever to have much more push down to that visual cortex. And kind of both of these are implicated in hallucination disorders, so serotonin and acetylcholine, and they both target these cells, which we think are really critical in conscious experience. I might breeze through this just because we're running out of time, but so in terms of other modalities, so auditory hallucinations are twice as common than visual, and we kind of wonder why that was. We've done a bit of research on this, looking at mental images, comparing different modalities, and what we saw is if we ask people about a whole bunch of different criteria, which ones are easier to do, most sustainable, most consistent, most vivid, clear, whatever, generally auditory imagery, so imagining sounds, the kind of pink bars here tend to be dominant on pretty much everything except location control. People can control the location of their visual images better than they can their imagined sounds. And we've kind of theorized why that might be. One reason is that just in vision, mental images, they kind of just don't have that push, whereas in auditory imagery, they do, and that's just kind of how the system's set up. They just kind of balance a bit differently. The other option is that sound simulations are supported by better motor simulation. So whenever we do mental imagery, we might move our eyes in a way that corresponds to what we're imagining, but we also kind of move our speech system in a similar way when we're imagining sounds as well. But potentially when we imagine sounds, if we imagine them as a sort of speech sound, as a kind of onomatopoeia, we can use kind of simulated motor movements, simulated speech patterns to inform what our imagery should actually sound like. And simulated speech gives you much better information than simulated eye movements, because eye movements tell you about where something is, but not what it is. Whereas simulated speech tells you when exactly something occurs and what it actually is as well. So I'll finish up there. The kind of takeaway message is ultimately kind of all the work we're showing is that potentially competition could prevent mental images from being truly seen as images. And that can explain a whole big bunch of phenomena to do with mental imagery. And I'll just thank my collaborators on this, so Amanda Robinson and Thomas Carlson. And it's also a QR code for the paper this was from. And yeah, thank you all for listening.